The morning sun filtered through the thick canopy as Dr. Lucia Vasquez wiped sweat from her brow. It was the summer of 1993, and the humid Costa Rican air clung to her skin like a damp cloth. She had been trudging through the rainforest since dawn, carefully documenting plant species in her worn field notebook. Lucia was 32, with 6 years of field research under her belt, but nothing in her education or experience had prepared her for what she was about to discover. Just a bit farther, she muttered to herself, pushing aside a large leaf that blocked her path. Her research on rainforest biodiversity had brought her to this remote area, a section that bordered private land owned by a large citrus processing company. The locals had mentioned something about the company using the forest edge for waste disposal, but Lucia hadn't given it much thought, until now. The rich, earthy scent of the forest suddenly changed. At first it was just a hint, sharp, citrusy, and out of place among the natural smells of soil and vegetation. As Lucia moved forward, the smell grew stronger, almost overwhelmingly sweet with an underlying sour note of rot. She wrinkled her nose and hesitated. Then curiosity pulled her forward. She pushed through a dense patch of undergrowth and stopped dead in her tracks. The lush green forest floor abruptly ended, and before her stretched what looked like an alien landscape, a vast expanse of orange. Mountains of discarded orange peels, pulp, and rind spread across several acres, some piles reaching nearly 6 feet high. The waste glistened in patches where morning dew caught the sunlight, while darker areas had begun to blacken with decay. "What on earth?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the buzz of insects attracted to the sugary feast. Lucia stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the scale of what she was seeing. This wasn't just casual dumping. This was industrial waste on a massive scale. She fumbled for the small camera in her backpack, her hands shaking slightly as she began documenting what she saw. Click after click, she captured the surreal scene. Vibrant orange waste contrasting against the green forest, the clear line where vegetation stopped, as if refusing to touch the acidic heap. Pulling out a small notebook, she began jotting down observations. The waste seemed fresh in some areas, indicating ongoing dumping, while other sections had clearly been there for months, sinking into dark, slimy masses. What disturbed her most was the complete absence of plant life wherever the orange waste touched. It was as if the forest had been erased, replaced by this bizarre citrus moonscape. The sound of machinery in the distance pulled her attention away. Through the trees, perhaps half a mile away, she could make out the outline of industrial buildings. The citrus processing plant, she assumed. Lucia felt a knot forming in her stomach. The company was clearly using this section of forest as their personal dumping ground, likely to avoid proper waste disposal costs. For the next 3 hours, Lucia meticulously documented everything: the approximate area covered, the depth of the waste, the distinct boundary where forest life ended. She collected soil samples from various points, at the edge of the waste, deep within a pile, and from the still healthy forest floor for comparison. The contrast was stark even to the naked eye. The soil beneath the orange waste had taken on an unnatural color and texture, smelling strongly of fermentation. "This has to be illegal," she murmured, carefully labeling each sample container. As an ecologist, she understood the potential damage. The highly acidic orange waste would alter the soil chemistry, potentially making it hostile to native plant species. Leachate, the liquid that drains from waste, could contaminate groundwater and nearby streams. The sheer volume suggested she was looking at nearly 1,000 tons of agricultural waste, carelessly discarded in a delicate ecosystem. As the afternoon wore on, Lucia noticed small flies and beetles swarming certain areas of the waste. Nature was already beginning its process of breaking down the organic matter, but the scale was simply too vast. Without intervention, this would take years, perhaps decades, to decompose fully. And what would happen to the forest in the meantime? Walking the perimeter of the affected area, Lucia spotted a small stream about 50 yards from the edge of the waste. Her heart sank as she approached and saw the water, normally clear in this region, had a slight orange tint and smelled faintly of citrus. Following the stream upward, she confirmed her fears. Runoff from the waste piles was already reaching the water system. By late afternoon, exhausted and emotionally drained, Lucia sat on a fallen log at the forest edge, looking out at the orange wasteland. 6 years of studying ecosystems had taught her that nature was remarkably resilient, capable of recovering from many human insults given enough time. But this was on another level entirely. Back at her small research station that evening, Lucia spread her notes and photographs across the table. Her 2 research assistants stood silently beside her, their expressions mirroring her own shock and concern. "I've never seen anything like it," said Paolo, the more experienced of the 2. "How could they just dump all that without any containment?" "Because they thought nobody would notice," Lucia replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This area isn't on popular hiking trails. It's not visible from the road. They probably figured they could hide it forever." The younger assistant, May, who specialized in soil chemistry, examined one of the samples under a portable microscope. "The pH levels in this soil are going to be way off. This could change the entire composition of the forest floor if it spreads." Lucia nodded grimly. "We need to report this immediately." That night, sleep eluded her. Lucia tossed and turned, her mind replaying the image of orange mountains against green forest. As a scientist, she was trained to observe and document without emotional attachment. But this felt personal, a violation of a place she had come to love during her research. The next morning, Lucia made a series of phone calls, first to her university department head, then to the Costa Rican Environmental Protection Agency, and finally to a journalist friend who worked for an international environmental publication. Each conversation left her more frustrated than the last. "They're saying it might not be illegal," she explained to her team after hanging up the phone. "The company claims they have permits for agricultural waste disposal on their land. They're arguing about whether the forest edge is protected or part of their property." "But what about the stream contamination?" May asked. "Surely that violates water protection laws?" Lucia sighed heavily. "That's the one area where we might have leverage. I've sent the water samples to the lab in San Jose. If they show significant contamination, we could force action." Over the next 2 weeks, Lucia divided her time between continuing her biodiversity research and documenting the orange waste site. She noticed subtle changes even in that short period. Parts of the waste mountain had begun to collapse inward as decomposition accelerated in the hot, humid climate. The smell had intensified, attracting more insects and even some bold birds that pecked at the fermenting fruit remains. When the lab results came back, they confirmed her fears: elevated acidity levels and organic compounds in the water, though not yet at concentrations considered immediately dangerous. The environmental agency representative sounded sympathetic but not alarmed on the phone. "I'm afraid this falls into a gray area, Dr. Vasquez," the man explained. "The company has been fined for improper disposal before, but they simply pay the fines and continue. It's cheaper for them than proper waste management." Frustration bubbled inside her. "So we just let them destroy this ecosystem? There's nearly 1,000 tons of waste out there." The long pause on the other end of the line told her everything she needed to know about the priorities at play. That evening, sitting alone by the research station's small fire pit, Lucia made a decision. If official channels wouldn't take this seriously, she would have to find another approach. The journalist friend had expressed interest in the story, particularly when she mentioned the scale of the dumping. Perhaps public pressure could accomplish what regulations apparently could not. As darkness fell over the rainforest, Lucia stared into the flames, mentally composing the impassioned email she would send along with her photographs and data. What she couldn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, on that warm night in 1993, was that this environmental disaster would eventually reveal something extraordinary about nature's power to heal and transform. She only knew that tomorrow. She would return to that orange wasteland with more sampling equipment, more cameras, and a renewed determination to document and expose what was happening in this forgotten corner of the rainforest. Whatever it took, she would make people see what she had seen. She would make them care. The forest seemed to whisper around her as the fire died down to embers. Lucia looked up at the stars visible through the canopy opening and made a silent promise to the ecosystem she had come to study and love. This would not be ignored. Someone had to stand up for the forest that couldn't speak for itself. Little did she know that her discovery was just the beginning of a story that would unfold over decades, a story that would challenge everything. Ecologists thought they knew about forest regeneration and nature's response to human Interference, the photographs spread across the conference. Room table told a disturbing story. Orange waste piled higher than a person stretching across acres of once pristine rainforest. The images captured exactly what Lucia had witnessed. But somehow they still failed to convey the overwhelming smell, the bizarre contrast of industrial waste against natural green, the wrongness of it all. "This is absolutely unacceptable," said Director Hernandez, the head of Costa Rica's Environmental Protection Agency. His normally calm demeanor had given way to visible anger as he examined each photograph. "How long has this been happening?" Lucia cleared her throat. "Based on the decomposition stages of different sections, I'd estimate they've been dumping for at least 18 months, possibly longer." The meeting room at the EPA headquarters in San Jose was packed. What had started as Lucia's personal crusade had quickly gained momentum after her journalist friend published a scathing article about the citrus company's practices. International environmental organizations had picked up the story, and suddenly everyone wanted to be part of the solution. "The public is demanding immediate action," said a representative from a prominent environmental group, his voice tight with barely controlled outrage. "That waste needs to be removed before it causes more damage. The company should bear all costs for cleanup and restoration." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. The sentiment was nearly unanimous. Remove the waste, punish the company, restore the forest. It was the obvious solution, the right solution, which was why Dr. Alberto Reyes's next words caught everyone by surprise. "What if we don't remove it?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Alberto, a soil ecologist who had worked with Lucia on previous research projects. He was known for unconventional thinking, but this suggestion seemed outlandish even for him. Lucia frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You've seen the photos. You know what's happening to the soil there." Alberto nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than combative. "I've not just seen the photos, I visited the site with you last week, remember? And yes, right now it looks like an environmental disaster, but I've been thinking about this from another angle." He stood up and moved to the whiteboard at the front of the room. "What is orange waste fundamentally? Organic matter, rich in nutrients, high in acidity, yes, but also full of compounds that will eventually break down. Eventually could mean decades, someone pointed out. Meanwhile, nothing can grow there." "Exactly," Alberto said, surprising them again. "Nothing can grow there now. But what about in 5 years? 10 years? What if instead of viewing this as just a disaster to clean up, we view it as a massive, unplanned experiment in forest regeneration?" The room erupted in voices. Some called the idea ridiculous, others dangerous. Director Hernandez raised his hands for quiet. "Dr. Reyes, are you seriously suggesting we leave 1,000 tons of industrial waste sitting in a protected forest as some kind of experiment?" Alberto met the director's gaze steadily. "I'm suggesting that removing it might not be the only option, or even the best one, ecologically speaking. Removal would require heavy machinery, which would cause additional damage to the surrounding forest. The process would be expensive and might not even restore the area to its original state." Lucia found herself torn. Her initial reaction had been the same as everyone else's: remove the waste, punish the company. But Alberto was a respected colleague whose scientific intuition she trusted. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "A controlled study," Alberto replied. "We monitor the site over time. Soil chemistry, microorganism activity, plant succession. We document how nature responds to and potentially transforms this disturbance. It could provide invaluable data on ecosystem recovery that we simply can't get from small-scale laboratory experiments." For the next 2 hours, the room debated the proposal. Environmental activists remained firmly opposed, seeing it as letting the company off the hook. Government officials worried about public perception. Scientists in the room were divided, some intrigued by the research potential, others concerned about prolonged damage. Through it all, Lucia found her perspective shifting. The ecologist in her was becoming increasingly interested in Alberto's proposal, even as the environmentalist in her continued to feel outrage at the company's actions. "There's still the issue of the stream contamination," she pointed out during a lull in the debate. "We can't allow that to continue," Alberto nodded. "Absolutely. We would need containment measures around the perimeter, barriers to prevent runoff, regular water testing, contingency plans if contamination spreads. This wouldn't be about doing nothing. It would be about careful observation and management while letting natural processes take their course. As the meeting finally adjourned with no firm decision, Lucia found herself walking with Alberto through the building's courtyard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the paved stones. "You really believe this could work?" she asked him. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Honestly, I don't know. But I do know that ecosystems have incredible resilience we don't fully understand. Think about it. After volcanic eruptions cover landscapes in lava and ash, life eventually returns. After forest fires, new growth emerges. Nature has been dealing with disturbances long before humans came along." Lucia considered this. "But this isn't a natural disturbance. It's industrial waste." "True," Alberto conceded, "but it's organic industrial waste. I'm not suggesting we would see the same outcome with toxic chemicals or heavy metals. There's something fundamentally different about this situation." 3 weeks later, Lucia stood before a different group, the company executives responsible for the dumping. The meeting had been arranged by Director Hernandez as part of ongoing negotiations about how to address the situation. "Your proposal is unexpected," said the company's CEO, looking genuinely confused. The man had come prepared for accusations and demands for expensive cleanup operations. Instead, he was hearing about a long-term research project. "To be clear," Lucia said firmly, "this doesn't mean what your company did was acceptable. The unauthorized dumping stops immediately, and there will still be fines for violations already committed." The CEO nodded quickly. Of course. But rather than spending millions on removal, which would cause additional disruption to the ecosystem," she continued, "we're proposing you fund a comprehensive research initiative. Monitoring equipment, research staff, containment measures to prevent further spread, all paid for by your company for the next decade minimum." The executives exchanged glances. Even with these expenses, they were clearly calculating that this would cost less than a full cleanup operation. Lucia could almost see the relief spreading across their faces. "We'd also expect community engagement," Alberto added. "Educational programs about sustainable agriculture practices, transparency about your waste management going forward, and a conservation easement on that land, permanently protecting it from development." By the time the meeting concluded, a framework for an agreement was taking shape. The company would avoid the most expensive cleanup scenario, but would face substantial costs and oversight nonetheless. The scientific community would gain an unprecedented opportunity to study ecological succession after a major disturbance. And the forest? Well, the forest would have to show them what it could do. Not everyone was happy with the compromise. Several environmental groups publicly criticized the decision, calling it a corporate handout. Some of Lucia's colleagues questioned whether the research value truly justified leaving the waste in place. On a warm evening, 1 month after the initial discovery, Lucia and Alberto stood at the edge of the orange waste site. Workers had spent the day installing the first monitoring stations and containment barriers around the perimeter. The setting sun cast an amber glow across the scene, making the orange waste look almost beautiful in the golden light. "I still can't believe we're actually doing this," Lucia said quietly. Alberto looked at her. "Having second thoughts?" She considered the question carefully. "No, but I'm nervous. What if nothing happens? What if it just sits here like this for years, killing everything it touches? Then we document that too. That's how science works." He gestured toward the waste piles. "But my gut tells me we're going to see something interesting here. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but eventually." Lucia nodded slowly. She had committed to this path now, this strange experiment born of an environmental disaster. For better or worse, they were about to witness what happened when human carelessness collided with nature's resilience. The first research team would arrive tomorrow. Equipment would be installed, baseline measurements taken, protocols established. And then would come the hardest part, the waiting. Watching as microscopic processes unfolded on their own timeline, refusing to be rushed by human impatience. As they walked back toward their vehicle, Lucia cast one last glance at the orange wasteland behind them. Somewhere beneath those rotting peels and pulp, the forest floor waited. Only time would tell if it could rise again. The first year brought nothing but disappointment. Lucia stood at monitoring station 3, clipboard in hand, recording the same dismal readings she'd been documenting for months. The orange waste had blackened and sunk by a few inches in most places. but otherwise the landscape remained as barren as the day they'd started the experiment. pH levels still too acidic for most plant life, she muttered, jotting down the numbers. The December heat pressed against her skin as she moved to the next testing site. 5 years into her career, this project had become her life's work. Though at moments like this, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Behind her, Alberto examined soil samples, his optimism somehow still intact. The microbial activity is increasing, he said, looking up from his portable microscope. Slowly, but it's happening. Lucia wanted to share his enthusiasm, but the critics' voices echoed in her mind. Just last week, the latest article had appeared in an international science journal, Orange Waste Experiment, Scientific Innovation, or Corporate Cover-Up. The piece had quoted several prominent ecologists questioning both the scientific validity of the project and the ethics of allowing the waste to remain. "It doesn't look any different," she said, gesturing at the dark, decaying mass stretching before them. "We've got nothing to show for a year's work except that things rot if you leave them long enough." "Hardly groundbreaking science." Alberto straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ecological processes don't run on human timelines, Lucia. You know that, she did know that. But knowing it intellectually didn't make the waiting any easier. By the 3rd year, subtle changes had begun to appear. The mountains of waste had collapsed into a thick, dark mulch that covered the forest floor like a strange, acidic blanket. The overwhelming citrus smell had faded, replaced by the earthy scent of decomposition. Still, no plants grew in the central areas, and water runoff continued to require careful management. The quarterly meeting with the citrus company executives had grown increasingly tense as impatience set in on all sides. "We've been funding this project for 3 years now," the CEO pointed out, tapping his pen against the conference table. "The public relations damage has been substantial. We need to see some positive results we can point to." Lucia maintained her professional composure, though inside she felt the same frustration. "I understand your position, but as we've explained from the beginning, this is a long-term study. Nature operates on its own timeline. Perhaps," said the company's legal counsel, "it's time to reconsider the original cleanup option." The suggestion sent a jolt of panic through Lucia. After 3 years of meticulous data collection, the thought of bulldozers rolling in to scoop everything away was unbearable. They would lose everything, all the baseline data, all the subtle changes they'd begun to document. "That would be scientifically irresponsible," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're beginning to see changes in the microbial communities. The pH levels are gradually shifting. Disrupting the process now would waste everything we've done so far." The meeting ended without resolution, but the message was clear. Patience was wearing thin. The novelty of the experiment had worn off, and both the company and the public wanted results. Tangible, visible results that could be photographed and published. That evening, Lucia sat alone in her small field office poring over 3 years of data. The changes were there in the numbers, subtle shifts in soil composition, the gradual neutralization of acidity, the emergence of microbial communities adapted to breaking down the citrus compounds. But they were changes only a scientist would appreciate, invisible to the untrained eye and certainly not dramatic enough to satisfy critics or corporate sponsors. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Alberto entered carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting one on her desk. "You've been at it for hours." Lucia rubbed her eyes. "I'm looking for something, anything we can show them. Some evidence that we're not just watching garbage rot." Alberto pulled up a chair. "Science isn't about quick wins, Lucia. Sometimes it's about being the person stubborn enough to keep looking when everyone else has given up." "Stubborn or foolish?" she asked with a tired smile. "Often the same thing until you're proven right." By year 5, the first significant change appeared, a small patch of fungus growing at the outer edge of the waste site. It wasn't much, just a cluster of pale mushrooms pushing up through the dark mulch. But to Lucia, it felt like finding water in a desert. She photographed it from every angle, collected samples, and documented its growth with the excitement of a child discovering something magical. "It's happening," she told Alberto, showing him the photographs. "Pioneer species, the first step in succession." The fungi spread slowly, their invisible mycelium networks creeping through the decomposed waste, breaking down complex compounds into simpler forms. Where the fungi appeared, The soil changed, becoming more hospitable to other life forms. But 5 years was a long time to wait for mushrooms. The initial research grant was running out, and renewal looked unlikely. 3 graduate students who had joined the project had already moved on to more promising work. The citrus company, while still legally obligated to fund basic monitoring, had cut its contribution to the broader research initiative. "They're calling it the orange folly in some departments," said Diego, the newest member of their dwindling research team. He had joined just a year ago, one of the few young scientists still interested in the project. "My professor at the university asked why I was wasting my time here." Lucia had grown accustomed to the criticism, but it still stung. "What did you tell him?" Diego smiled. "That I'd rather be part of something that might take decades to prove right than something safe that won't teach us anything new." By year 7, they were down to a skeleton crew. The monitoring stations had been reduced to the bare minimum needed to maintain scientific integrity. Lucia had taken a teaching position at the university to supplement her income, visiting the site only twice a week now instead of daily. Alberto had reluctantly moved on to other projects, though he still called regularly to check on the data. The changes remained painfully slow. More fungi had appeared, along with bacteria that thrived in the peculiar chemistry of the decomposed waste. Soil tests showed decreasing acidity and increasing nitrogen content. Good signs, but still not enough to support most plant life. In year 8, the first breakthrough occurred. After a particularly heavy rainy season, Lucia arrived at the site to find tiny seedlings emerging along the eastern edge. Hardy pioneer plants whose seeds had blown in from the surrounding forest or been carried by birds. Their delicate green shoots against the dark mulch nearly brought her to tears. She called Alberto immediately. "We have plants," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Actual vascular plants. Small ones, but they're definitely growing." The small victory renewed her energy. She applied for a modest grant to document the plant succession and, to her surprise, received it. A scientific journal agreed to publish their preliminary findings. The first positive academic attention the project had received in years. By year 10, patches of greenery had spread across about 20% of the site, primarily at the edges where the waste layer was thinnest. The central areas remained largely barren, a fact critics were quick to point out in response to Lucia's cautiously optimistic paper. "The orange waste experiment continues to bear little fruit," read one dismissive headline in an environmental publication. The article emphasized the limited nature of the recovery and questioned whether the same results couldn't have been achieved after a proper cleanup operation. Lucia had stopped reading the critics. After a decade of work, she had developed the scientist's long view, the understanding that some processes simply couldn't be rushed or judged by impatient human standards. The data told her that something remarkable was happening, even if it was happening slowly. In year 12, she received a visitor she hadn't expected, Director Hernandez, now nearing retirement from the Environmental Protection Agency. He hadn't been to the site in years, not since the early days of the project. "I wanted to see it for myself before I stepped down," he explained, as Lucia guided him along the monitoring path. "To be honest, I never expected it to last this long." She showed him the areas of new growth, the soil test results, the gradual changes documented over more than a decade. To her surprise, he listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about the succession patterns they were observing. As they reached the still barren central area, he stopped. "Do you still believe it was the right decision, to leave it here all these years?" Lucia considered the question carefully. "Scientifically, yes. We're learning things about ecological succession that we couldn't learn any other way. But professionally," she sighed, "it's been a hard road. Most of my colleagues think I've wasted my career on this." Director Hernandez nodded. "Sometimes the most valuable work doesn't show its worth until long after we're gone." He gazed out over the landscape, where patches of green now interrupted what had once been a solid expanse of orange waste. "I think you might be proving your critics wrong, Dr. Vasquez. It's just taking longer than anyone expected." His words stayed with her in the months that followed. Through more funding rejections, more skeptical articles, more colleagues gently suggesting she move on to more promising research. Whenever doubt crept in, she would walk the monitoring path, noting each new plant species that had taken hold, each square meter of waste that had transformed into something capable of supporting life. Progress remained frustratingly slow by human standards, but by the forest's measure, by the ancient rhythms of death, decay, and rebirth that had governed ecosystems long before humans existed, something extraordinary was beginning to unfold. Lucia just needed to be patient enough to see it through. 20 years after the orange waste was dumped, Lucia drove along the bumpy access road that led to the research site. Her hair now showed streaks of gray, and fine lines had formed around her eyes. Marks of 2 decades spent mostly outdoors, squinting at data collection sheets and soil samples. She hadn't visited the site in nearly 6 months, having secured a modest grant that allowed her to hire a small team to maintain the basic monitoring while she focused on analyzing the accumulated data. As the road curved through the forest, Lucia felt the familiar mix of hope and anxiety that had accompanied every visit for years. What would she find today? The last reports had been encouraging. The vegetated area had expanded to nearly 60% of the site, but she had learned to temper her expectations over the long years of this project. The vehicle rounded the final bend, and Lucia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She blinked, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her. Where there had once been a stark boundary between healthy forest and waste-covered ground, she now saw an almost seamless transition. The access clearing where they had always parked was nearly overtaken by vegetation. She stopped the car and stepped out, momentarily disoriented. "This can't be right," she murmured, checking her GPS to confirm she was in the correct location. But it was right. The monitoring station markers were still visible, small metal posts now surrounded by growth. Lucia walked slowly along what had been the main observation path, her mind struggling to process the transformation. Where patches of pioneer plants had been fighting to gain a foothold just months ago, now stood a dense growth of shrubs, young trees, and flowering plants. She pulled out her phone and dialed Alberto, who had retired 2 years earlier but remained closely connected to the project. "You need to come see this," she said when he answered. "Something's happening. Something big, within a week." Lucia had assembled a team of researchers, including Alberto, Diego, now a tenured professor himself, and several graduate students specializing in various aspects of forest ecology. They established a systematic survey of the entire site, documenting every species, taking hundreds of soil samples, and comparing the data with their decades of baseline measurements. The results were beyond anything they had dared to hope for. The soil carbon content is 176% higher than in the reference areas of the surrounding forest, Diego announced during their evening data review session. The team had set up a temporary field station, working from dawn until well after dark to document the remarkable changes. "That can't be right," said one of the graduate students, peering at Diego's tablet. "Run the analysis again." "I've run it 3 times, Diego replied, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "The numbers are solid. This soil isn't just recovered. It's superior to the undisturbed forest soil in almost every measure we track." Alberto, his hair now completely white but his eyes as sharp as ever, nodded thoughtfully. The orange waste provided an enormous input of organic material all at once. If we think about it, this is somewhat similar to what happens after a major flood deposits silt, just on a much larger scale and with different starting materials. Lucia moved through the site with a sense of wonder that rekindled the passion she had felt as a young scientist. Areas that had been barren black mulch for more than a decade now burst with life. The central zone, the last to show any recovery, now hosted a diverse community of plants, including several tree species that typically only appeared much later in the succession process. "Look at this," called Valeria, a botanist who specialized in tropical plant communities. She pointed to a delicate orchid growing from the fork of a young tree. "This species usually only appears in mature forest. It shouldn't be here for at least another 30 years in a normal succession pattern." Day after day, the surveys revealed more surprises. Bird species had returned to the area, including some that were becoming rare in other parts of the forest due to habitat loss. Insect diversity was extraordinarily high, with several specialist species that required specific plant hosts now thriving, where nothing had grown for years. "We need to document this thoroughly," Lucia told the team as they gathered around the camp table one evening. This goes against everything in the textbooks about how long forest recovery should take. The textbooks were written based on natural succession processes, Alberto pointed out. This isn't natural succession. It's something new. Accelerated succession triggered by an enormous one-time input of specific organic material. On the 5th day of the survey, the most astonishing discovery came from the forestry team measuring tree growth. The tree biomass in the recovered areas is 417% greater than in the reference forest, announced Rodrigo, the lead forestry researcher. His voice filled with disbelief at his own findings. The trees are not just growing here. They're thriving at rates we typically only see in managed plantation forests with regular fertilizer application. That night, Lucia sat alone by the campfire, staring into the flames as she tried to process the implications of what they were seeing. 20 years ago, she had stood at the edge of an environmental disaster, 1,000 tons of industrial waste dumped illegally in a protected forest. Now she was witnessing what might be one of the most remarkable cases of forest regeneration ever documented. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her career had been built around a decision many colleagues had criticized as environmentally irresponsible. She had faced accusations of selling out to corporate interests, of enabling a company to avoid proper waste management. For years, she had questioned her own judgment, wondering if the critics were right. Now, looking at the data, she felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication certainly, but also humility before the profound resilience of natural systems. Alberto joined her by the fire, easing himself carefully onto a camp stool. His knees weren't what they once were. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked. Lucia smiled. "Just thinking about all the angry emails I've received over the years. All the conference presentations where colleagues wouldn't even meet my eyes." Alberto nodded. "Science can be a lonely road when you're going against conventional wisdom. Was it worth it?" she asked, voicing the question that had haunted her through the lean years when funding dried up and interest in the project waned. All those years when nothing seemed to be happening? "You know the answer to that now," Alberto replied, gesturing toward the forest around them. In the moonlight, the silhouettes of young trees stood where once there had been only waste. But even if this hadn't worked, the attempt was valuable. Science advances through the questions no one else is willing to ask. As word of their findings spread through academic channels, interest in the project exploded. Researchers from universities around the world requested access to the site and the decades of accumulated data. Lucia found herself suddenly in demand for conferences and interviews, the Orange Folly now being described as visionary long-term research. The citrus company, seeing an unexpected public relations opportunity, reinstated and increased their funding. Even the environmental groups that had most strongly opposed the original decision began to cautiously acknowledge that the outcome had exceeded anyone's expectations. 6 months after the intensive survey, Lucia returned to the site with a different group, environmental policymakers and land management officials interested in applying the lessons from the project to other degraded areas. As she led them along the now lush paths, pointing out key features and explaining the unique succession pattern they had documented, she noticed how completely the transformation had erased the visual evidence of the original disaster. "If I hadn't told you what was here before, would you have known this wasn't always forest?" she asked the group. They shook their heads, looking around at the thriving ecosystem that surrounded them. "That's what makes this so revolutionary," Lucia explained. "We're not just talking about restoring damaged ecosystems to what they were before. Under the right conditions, we might be able to help them become even more productive, more diverse, more resilient than they were originally." One of the officials, an older woman with decades of experience in land management, looked skeptical. "So we should start dumping agricultural waste in degraded areas?" "That seems like a dangerous conclusion." Lucia shook her head. "Not at all. What we've learned is that specific types of organic material, applied in specific ways in specific ecological contexts, can jumpstart natural processes. The key is understanding the underlying mechanisms so we can replicate the benefits without the drawbacks." As the group moved deeper into the forest that had risen from the orange waste, Lucia felt a profound sense of completion. The disaster she had stumbled upon as a young scientist had transformed not just the forest but her understanding of how ecosystems heal and adapt. The decades of patience, of meticulous documentation when nothing seemed to be changing, had revealed something extraordinary about nature's capacity for renewal. In the dappled light beneath the canopy of young trees, where once there had been only rotting fruit waste, life now flourished in unexpected abundance. The forest had not simply recovered. It had reinvented itself, creating something new and vibrant from what humans had discarded as worthless. 30 years to the day after she had first stumbled upon the orange waste dumping site, Lucia stood at a podium in Stockholm, looking out at a sea of faces. The Nobel Prize ceremony had concluded hours earlier, but this special symposium, focused on revolutionary approaches to ecosystem restoration, was, in many ways, more meaningful to her than the formal award. When I first saw those mountains of orange peels and pulp 30 years ago, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion welling inside her, my only thought was to document the damage and demand removal. I never imagined that decision would lead us to completely rethink how we approach ecological restoration. The journey from environmental disaster to groundbreaking science had been long and often lonely. Even after the dramatic transformation of the site became evident, it had taken years of peer-reviewed publications, independent verification studies, and practical applications elsewhere to convince the scientific community that the findings weren't simply an anomaly. Now, looking at the rapt faces of scientists, policymakers, and students, Lucia could see that the paradigm had truly shifted. The approach born from the orange waste experiment, what had come to be called accelerated natural regeneration, was being implemented on 6 continents. What we learned from those 1,000 tons of orange waste, she continued, advancing to a slide showing before and after images of the site, is that certain types of organic material, properly applied in sufficient quantities, can dramatically compress the timeline of forest regeneration. What would take a century through traditional succession can now be achieved in 3 decades or less. After the symposium, Lucia found herself surrounded by young researchers eager to share their own applications of her methods. A woman from Brazil described reclaiming abandoned mining sites using coffee processing waste. A man from India explained how they had adapted the principles to restore land damaged by saltwater intrusion using rice, hulls, and coconut coir. Your work changed everything about how I approach restoration ecology, said a young graduate student, her eyes bright with admiration. I grew up reading about your orange waste site in textbooks. The comment made Lucia smile and feel suddenly old. She had been barely older than this student when she'd first encountered those mountains of citrus waste. Now her hair was silver, her face lined with the years spent outdoors documenting nature's slow, miraculous recovery. Back in her hotel room that evening, Lucia video called Alberto, now 82 and too frail to travel to Sweden for the ceremony. His familiar face appeared on the screen, still sharp-eyed despite his advanced age. How does it feel to be vindicated on the world stage? He asked with a smile. Lucia laughed softly. Strange. I spent so many years defending this approach that I don't quite know how to function without the opposition. You'll adapt, Alberto replied, just like your forest did. The following month brought another surprise. The CEO of the citrus company, not the original one who had authorized the dumping, but a woman who had taken over leadership a decade ago, requested a meeting. Lucia agreed with some trepidation. Though relations with the company had improved dramatically after the project's success became evident, there remained an undercurrent of wariness on both sides. They met at the research station that had been built at the edge of the original waste site, now a permanent field laboratory where scientists from around the world came to study the unique ecosystem. Thank you for meeting with me, Dr. Vasquez, the CEO said, extending her hand. She was younger than Lucia had expected, perhaps in her early 40s. I've been hoping to talk with you about the future. The future? Lucia echoed. The CEO nodded, her expression earnest. What happened here 30 years ago was a terrible mistake by our company. But what grew from that mistake, thanks to your vision, has been extraordinary. She outlined a proposal that left Lucia momentarily speechless. The company wanted to establish a foundation dedicated specifically to applying the principles of accelerated natural regeneration worldwide, with a focus on developing regions where deforestation and land degradation were most severe. We're prepared to commit $50 million as initial funding, the CEO explained, and we want you to lead it. Lucia sat back, stunned. Why now? After all these years? The CEO's answer was refreshingly direct. Honestly, it makes business sense. Sustainability isn't just a buzzword anymore. It's essential to our long-term survival as a company. But beyond that, she added, her tone softening, I think there's a feeling that we owe something to you and to the planet. What was once our greatest shame has become something we're actually proud to be associated with. The Accelerated Regeneration Foundation launched 6 months later. Lucia found herself leading an international team of scientists, working with communities from the Amazon to Madagascar, from the Appalachians to the mountains of Nepal. Each project was unique, tailored to local ecosystems and using locally available organic materials, agricultural waste, food processing byproducts, even properly processed urban compost. Not every application was as dramatically successful as the original orange waste site. Some ecosystems responded more slowly, some required different approaches or materials, but the underlying principle, that large-scale organic inputs could jumpstart natural succession processes, proved remarkably adaptable. On her 65th birthday, Lucia sat with Diego on a ridge overlooking what had once been a heavily logged area of rainforest in Colombia. 3 years earlier, they had worked with local communities to apply the accelerated regeneration approach, using waste from coffee and cacao processing. Already the bare slopes were greening, pioneer species giving way to more complex plant communities faster than anyone had predicted. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Diego asked, passing her a thermos of coffee. If you'd gotten your way at the beginning and had all that orange waste removed? Lucia considered the question, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the regenerating forest below. All the time, she admitted. It's strange to think that one of the most important scientific insights of my career came from being overruled. Diego laughed. That's the beauty of science. Being wrong can sometimes lead to better discoveries than being right. That evening, as their team gathered around a campfire with members of the local community who had become partners in the restoration work, Lucia felt the full weight of the journey she had traveled. From a young, outraged ecologist demanding corporate accountability to a woman whose name had become synonymous with a revolution in ecological restoration, a local elder, his face deeply lined from decades working under the tropical sun, raised his cup in a toast. To the forest that returns, he said simply in Spanish, and to those who help it find its way back. The circle responded, voices blending in the darkness beyond the fire's light. Lucia felt tears prick her eyes. This was the true measure of her work's impact, not the prizes or the publications, but communities around the world finding hope and practical solutions for lands that had seemed beyond recovery. The next morning, she woke early and walked alone through the young forest. Birds called from the growing canopy. Insects buzzed in the undergrowth, and everywhere was the sense of life returning, accelerating, thriving. She thought of all the sites around the world now applying variations of what had been, learned from those rotting orange peels. 3 decades ago, an American poet once wrote that the world would end not with a bang but a whimper. Lucia had discovered something different, that the world could be reborn not through dramatic technological interventions, but through understanding and working with the patient, powerful forces of nature. As she reached a clearing and looked out over the valley, where mist still clung to the trees in the early light, Lucia thought about all the young scientists now carrying this work forward. Some of them hadn't even been born when she first stood staring in horror at mountains of orange waste in a Costa Rican forest. They would take what she had discovered and push it further, find new applications, new materials, new ecosystems to heal. That was how science progressed, each generation building on the insights of those who came before, sometimes overturning them, sometimes expanding them in directions no one could have predicted. The disaster she had discovered 30 years ago had become a beacon of hope, proof that even in the face of environmental damage that seemed beyond repair, nature held the capacity for unexpected regeneration. The key was understanding how to unlock that potential, how to listen to what the forest was trying to tell us, how to work with natural processes rather than against them. As the sun rose fully above the mountains, casting golden light across the landscape, Lucia smiled. The orange waste was long gone now, transformed into a thriving forest, but its legacy lived on in forests around the world, in the minds of scientists and communities working together, and in a fundamental shift in how humans thought about healing the damage they had caused to the planet. Some might call it redemption. Lucia, ever the scientist, preferred to think of it as evidence. Evidence of the remarkable resilience of life and of the unexpected ways human mistakes could sometimes lead to discoveries that changed everything.